In addition to talking about Russia and Ukraine, Donald Trump addressed his controversial tariffs during that Oval Office appearance a short time ago. He made it clear that he's not concerned about cutting new trade deals and that the tariffs he's proposing are likely the final word on the subject.
The deals are made. There are no deals to make. They would like to do a different kind of a deal, and we're always open to talk. We are open to talk, including to Europe. In fact, they're coming over. They'd like to talk to us.
European negotiators say trade between the U.S. and EU could be effectively cut off if Trump goes ahead with a 30% tariff that he threatened over the weekend.
Prohibits the trade. So if you're talking about 30% or 30% plus, there will be a huge impact on trade. It will be almost impossible to continue the trading as we are used in a transatlantic relationship.
EU trade ministers are meeting today in Brussels to strategize a response to tariff threats from President Trump. The European Union is warning that trade with the U.S. could effectively be wiped out if President Trump makes good on his threat to slap a 30% tariff on goods imported from the bloc. Let's go to CNN's Vanessa Yurkevich, who is tracking this for us. The clock is ticking on these trade deals. Vanessa, where do things stand right now?
Yeah, we're just 3 weeks away from that major escalation happening on August 1st. President Trump, though, short time ago said in the Oval Office that he is open with talking to the European Union. In fact, he said that they're coming over, that they'd like to talking about the EU trade team. He did not specify who and when, but this is a little bit of the lines of communication opening at the same time that we're in crunch time right now for these countries to try to make deals before these tariffs escalate. As you mentioned, Trump said that on August 1st, the EU is going to be slapped with a 30% tariff. That's an increase from the 10% universal tariff currently on the European Union, our biggest collective trading partner. And that's in addition to all the other tariffs that the European Union is facing. Look at that, 50% on steel and aluminum, 25% on cars, and then you could see that escalation on the right-hand side of your screen there. The president has said that he is putting these major tariffs on our major trading partners because of the trade deficits that the U.S. has with other countries, including the European Union. Take a look at these numbers. So the U.S. exports to the European Union about $370 billion worth of goods. But we, the U.S., import about $605 billion worth. That means that the U.S. has a trade deficit of $235 billion. And they are such a major trading partner that 30% of global goods and services are traded between the United States and the European Union. And just look at the types of things that we get from the European Union. So we get pharmaceuticals, that includes medical and surgical supplies, cars, aircrafts, machinery, chemicals, major goods that are important and absolutely critical to the U.S. and to the U.S. economy. Now, interestingly enough, though, the U.S. does have a trade surplus on the services ends of trade. We have a $563 billion worth of imports that the U.S. brings in from the United States. You're talking about intellectual property, telecommunications, financial services, digital services. So we offer a lot to the European Union, and this is one of the ways that the EU could hit back if they wanted to, by putting tariffs on those services ends of our trade with the European Union. Now, just yesterday, the European Union was going to go forth by slapping countermeasures on $25 billion worth of U.S. goods. They paused that, and now they're rediscussing what the countermeasures could look like. There are reports in our CNN reporting that the countermeasures could now affect $84 billion worth of goods. That would be 22% of U.S. exports coming out of the United States going into the European Union. And Boris, of course, at the end of the day, it's a lot of the businesses on both sides of the pond that end up really suffering the financial burden of these tariffs, because it's the businesses that pay the tariffs and then ultimately have to make the decision to pass it down to the U.S. consumer. So on paper, looking like things are escalating, but there are conversations certainly behind the scenes between both sides about potentially how to de-escalate. But right now, Boris, that August 1st date is just 3 weeks away for a major escalation on the European Union, Boris.
Yeah, the days just keep ticking by. Vanessa Yurkevich, thank you so much for that.
Well, the European Union's Trade Commission has a stark warning about the impact of Donald Trump's trade war, saying his threatened 30% tariff on goods from the EU would effectively knock out transatlantic trade. The bloc delaying countermeasures that were meant to take effect today until early August in order to allow more time for negotiations. CNN business correspondent Anna Stewart is in London. So, look, there's a big assessment or reassessment or reassessment going on by EU trade ministers again today in Brussels because, frankly, they're probably discussing that they don't know what's going on at present, correct? What are you hearing coming out of that meeting?
Well, we just had the press conference with the EU Trade Commissioner, Maros Sefcovic, and the message, I would say, has kind of been the same throughout, which is they hope for peace, but they're preparing for war. And I think this latest announcement of a 30% tariff actually took everyone kind of by surprise because both sides have kind of voiced good noises on trade talks. It felt like both sides were coming together and perhaps they would reach somewhere. Goldman Sachs actually in a note said this letter to the EU from President Trump did come as a surprise. And the tariff level of 30% is higher than what we had in April at so-called Liberation Day. So it's actually higher than it was. It's not as high, though, as the 50% that was threatened at one stage by President Trump. Now, today in this press conference with the Trade Commissioner, they laid out what they're planning to do, which is negotiate. They have to the 1st of August until this tariff will take effect. So essentially, they're still in negotiations. Not much has changed on that front. However, they are preparing for retaliation. They paused a whole raft of tariffs that was due to come into effect tomorrow on US goods. They put a pause on that to allow those negotiations to take place. That was $25 billion, I think. They're also, though, Becky, discussing today the next round, because that was only for steel and aluminium tariffs, which was a very, very, very long time ago from the US. They're now looking at what comes next. What about the car retaliation? What about the retaliation, for instance, to this 30% level? So that's where they go next. They're looking at a $72 billion package of retaliation against the US. Of course, President Trump has made very clear that whatever trade partners retaliate with will simply be added to what the US puts on them. So we could see a real escalation going forwards, but not for just over 2 weeks. That is how long they have to keep negotiating at this stage. Interesting to see what this is going to do for the European economy. What it's going to do, for instance, for ECB decisions. We had a note from UBS earlier today saying they're now expecting not to have a rate cut this month, but for that to be pushed back to September. It's just more wait and see for Europe. You can see markets, they open lower. They're still pretty mixed, but nothing significant because I feel like we're still in trade negotiations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm looking at the US markets. And again, it really just feels like investors are sort of almost trying to kind of, sit this one out, or certainly look for other opportunities that they see. I mean, look, those are the live US markets. Some confusion clearly still. Good to have you. Thank you very much indeed.